What's good? How y'all doing this morning? Welcome back to the Dun's Favor here on Forever I Love Atlanta Sports Podcast. It's your boy, the Dun. Today, this morning, I am talking about the offensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers, Nathaniel Hackett. A lot of people have been saying that he is rumored to be a head coach for some teams. And I believe several weeks ago, there was an article. I forgot which news article here in the city of Atlanta came out with this as saying that Hackett is a good candidate for the Falcons. But we're here to talk about it. Another fan told me, hey, can you do one on Nathaniel Hackett? And, look, we do this for you guys. I don't do this for myself. So, that being said, we here, and I brought on an expert writer, not just for the Green Bay Packers, but he's a national award-winning writer for the NFL. Mainly the Green Bay Packers. Jason, what's good, man? How you doing this morning? Let everybody know who you are and where they can find you.
Well, thank you for having me on. You can find me on Twitter at @by_JBH. I write for SBNation.com. I've also written for NFL.com and Sports Illustrated. So yeah, let's jump into it.
Yes. All right. So appreciate you joining us. Guys, if you're new to the channel, y'all already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Also hit that like button. Share this content out with other Atlanta sports fanatics. And hit us up in the comment section. As always, come holler. It's your hometown sports podcast. Give me 1 second. Let me go ahead and share all this out to these Facebook groups so everybody can join us this lovely morning. All right. Good. Go. All right. Now, let's go ahead and get into it. Nathaniel Hackett. A lot of people kind of know the last name Hackett because he is the son of Paul Hackett. He was a long time offense coordinator in the league, and he was a head coach for the USC Trojans before Pete Carroll got there. Now, let's look at Nathaniel Hackett's resume right now. He was the assistant linebackers coach in 2003 for UC Davis out there in California. And then he went to Stanford for a couple of seasons and became their offensive assistant coordinator. And then became a recruiting coordinator that last year he was there in 2005. And then John Gruden brought him in during his last 10-year during that Tampa Bay regime. And from 06-07, he was the offensive quality control coach. And then Buffalo brought him in, Dick Duran, and he was the offensive quality control coach there as well for 2 seasons. And then when Doug Marrone left the Saints and became the head coach for the Syracuse Orange, he brought in Nathaniel to be the quarterback coach and tight ends coach in 2010. And then a year after that, he became the offensive coordinator from 2011 2012. And then when Marrone became the head coach for the Buffalo Bills, Syracuse ain't that far from Buffalo. So he went back to Buffalo and became their offensive coordinator for 2 seasons. And then that whole coach staff got fired, and they found their way down south to Jacksonville, and he was the quarterbacks coach for the Jaguars for 2015 to 2016, and then he was an OC for them for 16 through 18, and then here we are now. He's with Green Bay for the past couple of seasons, and Green Bay is doing well right now on offense. Now I know the last part when Mike McCarthy was there, a lot of people were speculating that Aaron Rodgers is done and all this. And I was one of the components. I'm like, I don't think Aaron Rodgers is the issue up there in Green Bay. I just feel like Mike McCarthy time has passed him by, especially the GM up there. Y'all wasn't investing in the trenches as well and not drafting well on defense. Now I know when y'all got the DC, what's his name? Penny.
Mike
Mike
Pettin.
Penny. Mike Penny. Yeah, when y'all got him the last year when Mike McCarthy was there, I started seeing y'all defense getting a little better. And I'm a big fan of Penny as a DC. I don't know about a head coach, but I said that y'all just need to keep him there and just bring y'all a better offensive play caller there. y'all did that by bringing in LaFleur. Just tell me about that transition from McCarthy to LaFleur.
Well, it was a pretty significant transition for the Packers, if for no other reason than McCarthy had been there for over a decade, which there are few coaches in the NFL that are able to stay in one place for that long, but it is very rare. The coaches you generally see having that kind of just sustainability are the Bill Belichick's, the Mike Tomlins, those kind of coaches that have won championships, be able to sustain a high level of play. To a certain degree, that was McCarthy as well. They won a Super Bowl in 2010. That was 5 or 6 years into his tenure, and they went to multiple NFC championships after that game. But as you pointed out, I think correctly, there was a dip in the offense performance, especially those last 3 years. Some of those seasons, you can attribute it maybe to an injury. Aaron Rodgers obviously missed a significant amount of time in 2017 with that broken collarbone. In 2018, he had that significant leg injury from the season opener, and he was never really right again that season. And yeah, those things are ultimately going to impact the way any offense performs. But the scheme itself had become an issue. And it's not that there aren't versions of that scheme that have been successful in other places, but that particular version of it had not evolved enough. And it also had lost some of the faith in the quarterback himself. You could see with the way that that offense was working in 2018 in particular, where there were in cases receivers getting open the way it was designed, but not on the schedule that it needed to be. And that's where you had some of those issues where Rodgers is extending plays far more frequently than he had in the past. And while that certainly can work because of how talented he is, that's not a sustainable model at the frequency that they were running it. So they bring in LaFleur. And LaFleur's offense, while in a very loose sense, comes from the same root. It comes from comes from Kyle Shanahan, which comes from Mike Shanahan, which comes from Bill Walsh. That's ultimately the genesis of all of these versions of the offense. It was otherwise very different. It's a far more structured offense. And I mean, the Atlanta Falcons certainly are familiar with this offense too. It's the one that Kyle Shanahan ran in 2015 and especially in 2016. A lot of play action, a lot of bootlegs, a lot of designed rollouts, things that allow the quarterback to throw in rhythm more frequently, creates more open receivers on a more regular basis. And while there are still opportunities for freelancing, those opportunities don't come around quite as frequently. So with a quarterback like Rodgers, it played up to his strengths ultimately because he can still freelance when absolutely necessary, but it keeps him in structure more often. And that's allowed the offense to really take it to another level in 2020.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I know a lot of people was high on McCarthy when McCarthy got fired. It was people here in Atlanta, oh, we need to bring Mike McCarthy to Atlanta. And I'm like, no, we don't need to do that. Like I said, Mike McCarthy is his play calling is
It was a
philosophy.
problem. You can acknowledge it was a problem.
It's outdated. It's outdated. Like, yes, y'all won the Super Bowl in 2010. I get it. And in 2011, y'all went 15-1. Rodgers was a unanimous MVP of the league. I get it. But going back to that 2010 season, y'all won that Super Bowl. A lot of people forget that y'all had a good defense.
Yeah, the
Had a good
Packers had a
defense that
really
year.
strong defense that season. That was a big part of their story. And to your greater point, it's not that a coach like McCarthy or a coach running that version of the West Coast offense cannot be successful. It's that the version that they were running, the exact version that the Packers had in 2017 and 2018, was not doing enough to help the quarterback. And if you look at the NFL as a whole, there are very few high-level offenses that aren't doing things to elevate the play of their quarterback. They're taking some of the burden off of them. This is not specific to Green Bay. This is not specific to Atlanta. You look at the Rams, who, again, they're running another version of that Shanahan-derived offense. There are a lot of things in there that take weight off of Jared Goff. I mean, he may still make mistakes. We certainly saw that this Sunday, but there are more things that he has to do that are just in the rhythm of the offense. Dump offs to a tight end that's going across the formation on split zone. Those sort of things make life a lot easier because even though they still have to make big plays here and there, most of the plays are going to be of that variety, the sort of designed 5 to 10 yard gains that the defense is not going to be able to account for very easily. That's what all of these offenses in the NFL, the best ones do. Andy Reid, which again, exactly.
Thank you. Look, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
But
Go ahead.
you preaching this morning because we've been telling Falcons, especially this Falcons fan base, like coaching matters, man. If you cannot design and be creative as an offensive minded, as an OC or offensive minded head coach, your quarterback is going to look horrible. And it's not on the quarterback; it's predicated off the play calling. Look at us right now. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the Falcons. Dirk Cutter is horrible. He is a horrible play caller.
It is a problem for them. And this is not something specific to this version of the Falcons. Dirk Cutter, with his first run, had more success primarily because of the things that defenses were doing at the time. Defenses across the league, and even if you go down to college football, have changed. Dirk Cutter has not adjusted enough with those changes. So it brings us back to the big point here. It's not that there's a particular scheme or schemes that work or don't work. There has to be adjustments within that, flexibility within the play calling, within the schemes to help the quarterback. Otherwise, there's certain quarterbacks that can elevate any offense because they're that talented, but most of them are going to be in that middle group where, depending on the style and quality of the play calling and the offensive scheme, they could be anywhere between a borderline all-pro to someone who is barely able to start 16 games in a season because of performance. So there's a lot of variance in there, and it does derive from the coach and the play caller.
Bingo. Thank you. Like, we've been telling the people this all the time. Everybody's saying, "Oh, it's Matt Ryan's fault. It's Matt Ryan's fault. We need to trade Matt Ryan. Oh, we need to go ahead and draft. We need to draft his replacement. We need to get Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence." And I'm like, no. The problem with the Falcons is not at quarterback. We horrible at defense right now. Like, in the offensive line, you look at it yesterday, like. But most of sometimes, with offensive line, that offensive line play call, the offensive line, it could be predicated also on play calling because, like you said, with Mike McCarthy, with when he was there, Aaron Rodgers, he was pretty much looking for those long developing plays downfield. And Matt Ryan right now, he's doing the same thing under Dirk Cutter.
Yeah, and again, the quality of the players on the field and the play calling have to mesh in a certain way. The Falcons have made significant investments in the offensive line. They spent 2 first-round picks, as I'm sure you know and your listeners know, on offensive linemen just a few years ago. That's not a fait accompli that those are bad selections. Offensive linemen oftentimes take a few years to really figure out the NFL game, especially given how different the NFL game and the college game still are at this point. But you have to factor that into play calling. What a lot of the good teams are doing now, at least the good offensive teams, to sort of circumvent those offensive line issues, is to lean a lot more into play action. And this is something that the Falcons have done a lot in the past. 2016 was the prime example. There were maybe 1 or 2 teams in the entire league that season that called more play action or more pre-snap motion than Kyle Shanahan called with the Falcons. Part of the reason they did that is because the Falcons offensive line, while capable, was not, it wasn't the wall of Dallas from the 90s. That is a really smart way through play calling of getting around those sort of issues. And it's the same kind of thing that they can do now. The Falcons are calling play action. It's not like it's not a part of their offense, but it's not nearly as big of a part of the offense as it needs to be. And this is, again, not an issue that's just the Falcons. It's endemic to a lot of teams in the NFL right now. But those are things that the play caller needs to do. And ultimately, when it comes to the Falcons' next head coach selection, or if it ends up being Raheem Morris and it comes down to who they're hiring as the offensive coordinator, that is the big question that hangs over all of it.
Bingo. That's where we're getting at. Like, a lot of people have been, saying, well, we didn't hire defensive coordinators and head coaches for a long time. We need to get somebody here who know offense. And I'm like, okay, well, how about this? How about and I've been telling people this for a while now, how about if I tell you Dan Quinn and Mike Smith was never proven to be head coaches from the get-go? Because those guys, they was under head coaches who were defensive-minded coaches who built those teams to be, good defense, good defensive teams. Jack Del Rio and Pete Carroll. So I try to tell them that. Some people, okay, yeah, you're right. And then some people are like, well, no. Well, Dan Quinn built the Legion of Boom. I'm like, no, he did not build the Legion of Boom. Like, he came there, the same year that they won Super Bowl, but before that, they still had a good defense. We just beat them in the playoffs in 2012. So, but
yeah, and look, when it comes to any sort of head coach hiring process, the important thing for the team in question is figure out what parts of the performance of the previous team are just relevant to that team and which parts can be extrapolated to a new team. In the case of Dan Quinn, yeah, he didn't beat the Legion of Boom, or he didn't build, the Legion of Boom defense, but he definitely brought it to a new level. There was reason to believe that some of those things could translate. Ultimately, that wasn't really the problem because they did build a version of that Seattle very cover 1, cover 3 heavy defense in Atlanta. The issues were in some cases injuries, and there's nothing you can do to account for that. If Deion Jones plays more games in some of those seasons, it might be totally different. That's how impactful of a player he is and how meaningful his absence was. But a lot of these decisions are still going to come down to offense, even if the coach in question is not from the offensive side, because it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If there's a team with a good offense, the assistants off that staff or the offensive coordinator, if the head coach is not himself the offensive play caller, are going to get picked off. When that happens, what is the counter? So you look at the Falcons in 2016, one of the all-time best offenses by any objective measure. Kyle Shanahan is then hired away in 2017 to the 49ers. The Falcons respond with Steve Sarkisian, who has actually had a fair amount of success since leaving the Falcons and had, I think, more success than he's given credit for with the Falcons. But the drop-off was still significant, and that was a big part, along with some of the other things that we talked about, why the Falcons were unable to get back to the Super Bowl with that group of personnel. So now they're in a situation again where whether it's retaining Raheem Moore as the full-time head coach or hiring someone else to replace him, they are going to have to figure out what part of what we have working is going to stay there, what part from the assistants that we're looking at or the full-time head coaches that are just out of work at the moment, what are they going to bring that's relevant to them and not just to the teams that they were coaching previously. I think that's where we get into the discussion of Nathaniel Hackett.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't want nothing to do with Dan Quinn remnants on his team. Then they get rid of everything. We got rid of the GM, who was also the problem here for a long time. Yeah, I know. But he drafted Matt Ryan and Julio Jones. Okay, well, what did he do in the trench? He drafted that worked out. What we drafted Lindstrom, McGarry, and Matthews, several years ago. Well, Matthews several years ago, and then we brought in Alex Mack, via trade back in 2000. After that, in 2016. But like I said, in order for you to be successful in this league, you have to invest in the trenches. If you're not investing in the trenches, you're not winning anything.
And he tried, right? Like he spent all of those picks on offensive linemen, acquired Alex Mack. And I mean, there's a one point heading into the season where it looked like the Falcons were going to start an entire offense of first-round picks. That obviously includes the offensive line. And I do like some of those investments. Chris Lindstrom, I know, has not played at a terribly high level thus far, but he was a raw prospect coming out of Boston College. The reason why he was so highly coveted, and it wasn't just the Falcons who felt that way, was because of how incredibly athletic he is for an offensive lineman. And when you look at some of the schemes that are most successful in the league right now, they prioritize zone blocking, a scheme that requires really mobile offensive linemen. That outside zone play action scheme, the one that is extremely successful in San Francisco, in Los Angeles with the Rams, Green Bay now, all of those are predicated on that outside zone, that wide zone sort of run, and the play action plays you can build off of that. The best way to implement those kind of schemes is to have nimble offensive linemen. So they tried. Some of those picks are ultimately not going to work out because nobody hits at 100%, but it was probably the right idea and, at least to some degree, the wrong implementation. I think that's a big reason why, as you pointed out, they don't have the same GM or the head coach they started the season with.
And I like Lindstrom and McGarry. I think they're still young,
very young.
But at the same time, I feel like they're going to be a force, especially if we bring in a better offensive play caller here. So I agree. I'm not knocking them. But the issue we have now is Mack is going to end up leaving soon.
Almost certainly, yes.
Yeah, we already grooming Matt Hennessy to be our center. And, the left guard spot is wide open right now. And then Matthews, he kind of struggles here and there. Still a good, tackle. But right now we're looking at picking third. So I've told people, if we're still at that third spot, I'm going to get Sewell. Either get Sewell or I'm trading that pick and moving back in the first round.
I think both of those are actually really smart approaches because while there's a lot of talent on that Atlanta offensive line, it certainly makes sense to prioritize those sort of positions in the future. You can find certain other positions deep into the draft. You don't have to spend a first-round pick on a running back to have a really strong running game. You don't have to spend a first-round pick on an off-ball linebacker to have a really good linebacking core. But there are position groups that are much, much harder to find after the first round. Offensive line, especially on that exterior, those offensive tackles, not impossible, but significantly more difficult. It's why a player like Jake Matthews, as you just described, he has his faults, but if he suddenly became available, there's at least 16 other teams that would jump at the chance to get him. That's because it is extremely difficult to find that sort of player outside of the first round or outside the trade market. So looking at it from Atlanta's perspective, if they're in a position to draft someone who I've heard compared by scouts to Tyron Smith coming out of USC, that's absolutely a pick they should make, because worst case scenario, you have too many quality offensive tackles. That is a great problem to have. It means that you have depth. It means that, especially in the case of McGarry, I know that he's crazy tall, but he has the ability, because of his athleticism, to play inside as well. And that would allow them to move more of their talent into the interior. And all of this could work in concert for whatever scheme they bring in. So to that point, I think we should probably start talking about Nathaniel Hackett, because while he comes off in a direct sense that Matt LaFleur, and in a larger sense that Kyle Shanahan tree, there's a lot more interesting stuff in his background, and also a lot more concerns. This is not a perfect head coaching candidate that the Falcons could or could not consider.
Okay, appreciate it. So let's go ahead and talk about Hackett real quick. Now, like I mentioned earlier, he's the son of Paul Hackett. Now, he's not with, and that's weird. He's the OC there in Green Bay, because his philosophy it's not that Kyle Shanahan, Mike Shanahan, LaFleur type of offense. He has a different, and I believe that's why LaFleur brought him in, I guess, to bounce ideas off him. Am I right or wrong?
You're absolutely right. That's absolutely the concept there. So if you look at his history, I know you threw it up on the board earlier. There's a lot of different stuff in there, but the key piece is all of those times that he was coaching underneath Doug Marrone. Marrone brought him obviously to Syracuse, and then brought him to his next two stops. Buffalo, when he was made the head coach, and then initially with the Jags as he was an assistant, then moved up from an interim to the head coach full time. That was Doug Marrone's guy. That was the offensive play caller that the Jags had when they went to the AFC title game and almost beat the Patriots. And that loss I don't put on any of the coaches, to be honest with you. I put that almost exclusively on Blake Bortles. It's another situation where there's only so many things you can do to scheme around an extremely flawed quarterback. And they tried. It's the reason why they were so successful in the first three quarters, and why that fourth quarter, the Patriots were finally able to bridge the gap. But you look at what Hackett, now we're talking about the son, Nathaniel Hackett, was able to do. There are a lot of stuff, there are things within his offense, the offense that he ran in Jacksonville and previously in Buffalo, that make life easier for the quarterback. It's different than the Shanahan concepts. At least some of them are. You were right to say that. It's a lot less of those condensed formations. Big part of those Shanahan offenses where you see the offensive skill position players very close to the offensive line, or in bunches, or both. That wasn't as much of the case with Hackett. That's something that he may have learned during his time in Green Bay. He's now been there for 2 years, but we don't know at this point whether he is or isn't, for lack of a better way of putting it, a Shanahan acolyte. Those are big parts of the Shanahan offenses, even the ones that are run by coaches who didn't come off of Shanahan directly. But Hackett's been in Green Bay for 2 years. He spent a lot more time under Marrone. It is very much an open question how much of the LaFleur, Shanahan, McVay offense is going to appear if and when he becomes a head coach and play caller somewhere else.
But here's the thing. You mentioned Marrone. Marrone was under the coaching staff of Herm Edwards back in 2003. And who was the OC then? It was Paul Hackett, his dad. So I feel like that's that tie right there that Marrone had with Hackett. And a lot of people don't remember Marrone. Marrone was on that 2006 New Orleans Saints staff as well as their OC, I believe. So
you're absolutely right. And if you're looking at Marrone specifically, the scheme is less true West Coast and more of that evolved Air Coryell offense that the Chargers ran in the late 70s and early 80s. Now, a lot of things have changed in its sense, and a lot of things have changed with all of these offenses since then. But those schemes are very different in a lot of key ways. Even if they're running the same concepts, the language is extremely different. The Air Coryell offense is very numbers driven in terms of what the actual play call is called. The West Coast offenses are a lot more color driven. You see a lot of green, north, directional things. And the big difference when it comes to actually executing this offense from the language perspective is that it takes a lot more time to call out the Shanahan and West Coast offensive play calls. They are literally in some cases triple the amount of syllables. So when you're in the huddle, that may not.
And that's why you can't audible out of Shanahan play calls.
It's one of the reasons. The other reason is because a lot of those plays are designed to look the same, whether it's a run, it's a pass, a play action pass, all of those things. They don't want the plays to completely change that much at the line of scrimmage. They want to maybe audible out of a bad run if that's the way the defense is lining up, or audible into the run if the defense doesn't have the numbers to stop it. But they want those plays to look very similar. That's why they don't have full audible control. They have what they call the can calls. I'm sure Falcons fans remember Matt Ryan at the line of scrimmage, and he even does this now, where instead of a full audible, it's just a can or a kill call. Those two things are more or less the same. It's when there's a second play call that was given in the huddle that the entire offense can go to. It's a very effective strategy, especially with young quarterbacks, and it offers a lot of versatility to those other offensive players who may not be as well versed in the scheme as the quarterback, but there are limitations too. You can't do the full level of audibles that you can in certain other offenses, like the Air Coryell offenses, like the Earnhardt Pink or Perkins offenses. So there's pros and cons with all of these things. It's really just finding the right version for a particular team's personnel. And in the case of the Falcons, we've already seen that Shanahan scheme work to such a high level. I think versions of that are the most logical way to approach the 2021 season and beyond.
All right. And so this is the big question, and we need to know: is he calling the plays up there in Green Bay?
No, Matt LaFleur is calling the plays, specifically what Nathaniel Hackett offers to the offense. And this has been the case since 2019 when he first got there, is he is the designer of those red zone plays. That is the big part on game day of the scheme that he is responsible for. Now, in 2019, the Packers were not a bad, but not a great red zone offense. That has changed in 2020. They are one of the best red zone offenses, full stop, in terms of getting to the red zone and in terms of turning those red zone trips into touchdowns. That tends to be a very sticky stat in terms of being able to be predictive of what future success is or isn't going to be. Teams that perform really well in the red zone tend to have a lot of success in the playoffs if they get there. That bodes very well for Green Bay and then long-term for Nathaniel Hackett. But he isn't the play caller, and that's a very important thing. Not because we haven't seen non-play calling assistants become good head coaches. There's a very good example of this right now with the Colts. Frank Reich, though he had called plays in the past, didn't do so with the Eagles as their offensive coordinator, and is now one of the best head coaches of the NFL, full stop. So Hackett not calling the plays in Green Bay, I don't think is ultimately the end of the world from the perspective of his candidacy, but it is an open question. What does he do? What does he not do? Because it isn't his scheme, at least not the scheme that he's run in the past in Green Bay. Has he adjusted that scheme? Has he absorbed some of those concepts into what he likes to run? If the answer to those questions are yes, then I think he becomes a much more attractive candidate. If he wants to run a scheme closer to what he did before, I think he's still someone who could garner consideration seriously, but it's a very different calculation because you're looking a lot more like the schemes that are run now in Las Vegas, because again, he's in some way comes off of that Gruden tree, a different part of the West Coast offensive tree. And those things, again, they can work, but they work in very different ways. And with the Atlanta Falcons, you haven't seen those sort of schemes before. Doesn't mean that they won't work, but it's more of an adjustment for them.
All right. Cool. And that's what I was getting at. You know, I've always been known, like, I don't think he's really calling the plays up there in Green Bay because they run in West Coast, and I always knew Hackett is not a West Coast offensive coach. Yeah, he's there for like preparations and all the other stuff, but as far as like actually calling the plays in the game, I don't think he's doing that.
He isn't, but if that's the biggest concern that the Falcons or another team has about him, he does have play calling in his past. He was the offensive play caller in Jacksonville. He was also the offensive play caller in Buffalo. And while those weren't like top of the league offenses, neither of them had anything remotely approaching a top of the league quarterback. And they were able to overcome a lot of those disadvantages. So I do think there is something there worth looking into. I'm not sure he would be the top of my list if I'm the Falcons. If I'm them, knowing that even if they theoretically want to trade Matt Ryan, it would be such a massive cap casualty that they can't do it in 2021. And more to the point, while Matt Ryan is not young, by quarterback standards, he still has, if he stays healthy, 4 to 5 more good years. If I'm the next head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, I'm looking to maximize those years. The best seasons that Matt Ryan has ever had was the 2016 season under Kyle Shanahan. Now, Shanahan himself is not available, but I would look for either a head coach who's going to bring in that scheme as the offensive play caller or a head coach that is going to bring an offensive coordinator who's going to bring in that scheme. And there are definitely guys who can do that. Maybe Nathaniel Hackett is that guy because of Green Bay, but you can also look at some of the guys who are currently on that 49ers staff. Robert Saleh, not an offensive coordinator, an offensive play caller, but one of the first things that he's going to try to do, I would imagine, whether it's in Atlanta or somewhere else,
He's going
is
to
bring one of
replicate
those.
that San Francisco offense.
Exactly. And there are several very highly thought of assistants on that 49ers staff right now. Mike McDaniel and Mike LaFleur, the younger brother of Matt LaFleur, have both already received head coaching interviews in the past. They were candidates for the Browns job last year. Now, I'm not saying they're ready to be head coaches, but I think either one could be an offensive play caller right now. And I think those are the two top candidates if you're Robert Saleh, wherever you go. And there's another key difference now versus a few years ago. The NFL changed their hiring rules based on some of the Rooney Rule inefficiencies that they had in the past. Now NFL teams cannot block assistants if they're interviewing for what's called a bona fide coordinator position. If Robert Saleh were to take the head coaching position in Atlanta and was to offer the offensive coordinator position to either Mike McDaniel or to Mike LaFleur, there's nothing the 49ers could do to stop it, even though in the past, Kyle Shanahan has blocked those interview opportunities. That means that Saleh can realistically walk into any one of these head coaching interviews for himself and say, I'm bringing with me not just the Kyle Shanahan scheme, but specifically this guy who ran it at a high level with the 49ers. And I think that's a much more compelling case than we've had for a lot of defensive coaches in the past.
You know what? And another person you didn't mention, neither that's a good West Coast who can be another good offense coordinator, Clint Kubiak.
Clint Kubiak is extremely, extremely young.
Yeah,
obviously, he's the son of Gary Kubiak. And Kubiak himself, he's not just part of that larger West Coast picture. Kyle Shanahan coached under Gary Kubiak. Gary Kubiak was the head coach of the Houston Texans when Kyle Shanahan became an offensive coordinator and play caller for the first time. So these aren't just similar schemes. The bones of those offenses are the same. And Clint Kubiak, very, very young. I can't say either way whether or not he's ready to be the offensive play caller. He's not currently in Minnesota. That is his father, Gary Kubiak, but everyone has to get their chance at some time. And while I certainly think it's a fair question to say, is this just pure nepotism? Because he went up the coaching ranks, that being Clint, very, very quickly. You could have said the same thing about Kyle Shanahan too. And while not every one of those situations is going to work out, sometimes there's a huge benefit to just being around football coaches your entire life. Clint Kubiak is certainly an example of that, having been around not just his father, but Mike Shanahan and a lot of those other really just architects of that wide zone play action heavy scheme. So while I think that's more off the beaten path, I don't think that's a bad idea to seriously consider if you're the Falcons.
Exactly. I agree with you. I got a few questions from for people that's in the chat. Devontae, he has options on Hackett versus Bieniemy because Bieniemy, he's a hot commodity right now. And a lot of people here in Atlanta, they want Bieniemy to be the next head coach. What's your thoughts on Bieniemy?
So while both of those coaches come off of the West Coast tree, those offenses are still very, very different in a very reductive sense. The Shanahan offenses are very heavily structured, and the Andy Reid offense is much more open. Bieniemy obviously comes off the ladder. So the benefit to not specifically the Falcons, but to any team is that there's a lot more things you can build into those concepts. There's a lot more spread opportunities because of the formations. And in a more general sense, that's the way the college football is going. It's becoming less structured and more open. So when it comes to incorporating young players, guys who are freshly out of the draft, it's going to be less of a transition for them. Part of the reason that the Falcons had offensive struggles in 2015, the first year under Shannon, is because it takes more time to learn that offense. Whereas with an offense more like Bieniemy's, it's not that there isn't any transition, but the transition tends to be smaller. So given that the Falcons are probably going to bring in a lot of new players around that offensive core, there's a good argument that Bieniemy might be a better fit. But at the same time, if you're looking at Hackett and you were assuming for sake of argument that he's going to bring in a version of the Shannon offense, that's already to a degree what's installed there. So the transition is going to be less because there's just not as much of a transition to have. I tend to think if you're hiring a coach in 2020 for 2021, Bieniemy is the better candidate. He has more years playing or coaching in a high level offense. And even if when he first got there, he wasn't doing a ton out of his positional coaching, his role has increased every single year he's been in Kansas City. Even when he became the offensive coordinator initially, he wasn't the play caller, and he's still not the play caller full stop now. But Andy Reid does give him the ability to call plays situationally, and Andy Reid does not do that if he doesn't trust Eric Bieniemy as a coach. I think that is a very strong endorsement, and Andy Reid has come out and said in no uncertain terms, Eric Bieniemy should be a head coach right now. The league is just giving me this massive advantage, letting him stay on my staff. So if Andy Reid believes that Eric Bieniemy is ready to be a head coach, I'm inclined to believe him. So of those two, I think I would lean in that direction.
Yeah, here's my thing on Bieniemy. And I'm not looking at the game from yesterday. I know he did only score for 17 points on one of the worst pass defenses in the league. But the issue I had, and I had people come on my show who works with Kansas City, and they interview these coaches. The enemy's not even calling the plays out there in Kansas City. So that's to me, him and Hackett is kind of in that same category when we talking about experience in play calling. Yes, I know some people say, well, Doug Peterson, he was with Reed and he wasn't calling the plays with Andy Reid, but he went to Philadelphia and won a Super Bowl with them. Yeah, I get that. It's some rare occasions, like you said earlier, it happens. Some coordinators who had no experience in calling plays, as an OC or a DC, they went to another team and they still found success. So, but
Yeah, and I think I think it's worth pointing out here that while Eric Bieniemy is not the full-time play caller in Kansas City, he actually does have that experience in his past. Back when he was the offensive coordinator for Colorado, he was the play caller.
Yep,
so, yeah, while that doesn't guarantee that he would be a high-quality play caller in another stop, having that experience, I think, matters. If you look to a lot of coaches who have no or very limited play calling experience, any little bit helps. Matt LaFleur, for example, only had one season as a play caller in the NFL. That was 2018 as the offensive coordinator of the Tennessee Titans. And it wasn't overall a great offense. It got better near the end of the season. I think that probably was a good thing in his corner when he was interviewing for that Green Bay job. But it wasn't like he was blowing the doors off offense or defenses rather that season as the OC. But he was a much better play caller that first year in Green Bay. And now he's brought it to a whole nother level for himself. So I think getting that process started is big. It doesn't mean that you can't be a good play caller without the experience, but I think it's something that teams are going to look for. Bieniemy is calling the plays situationally right now in Kansas City, and he has full-time play calling experience in his past. When you combine those things with, if he were to become the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, a still really, really good core of offensive players. Matt Ryan is conservatively still one of the, and I mean very conservatively still, one of the 12 best quarterbacks in the NFL. In the right scheme, he can be much better than that. Julio Jones, at least when he's healthy, is conservatively one of the 5 best receivers in the NFL. Calvin Ridley is getting right up to that level as well. And the offensive line, as we discussed earlier, has a lot of talent. It's not really ready yet, but it's going to get there, you think, at some point in the next few years. You bring in a scheme, whether it's from Bieniemy or someone else, that's well implemented, well coached, and well called. I think that turnaround can be very quick. I don't think that the case with the Falcons is they're going to need 2-3 years to turn it around if they make the right hire. The Falcons could be a playoff team in 2021 if they make the correct hire and the correct moves around it. Bieniemy might be that guy. I don't know enough about him personally to say whether or not he's a fit there in terms of his personality. I have heard that he is an acquired taste, which for some teams is going to mean that he makes a lot of sense. He's a guy who is extremely religious. I don't think he actually really hides that very much. There are owners who are going to love that. They're going to embrace the fact that he is so faith forward. There are also going to be owners that want nothing to do with it. And keep in mind, the owners may not always be affirmatively making these decisions, but their voice is in that room, and that's going to matter. So with Arthur Blank, I can't say definitively whether he prefers one over the other, but it's something that is going to come up if and when Bieniemy interviews with the Falcons.
Here's my thing with, and we said Bieniemy. You mentioned when he was in Colorado, Colorado's offense was horrible.
It was, but also Colorado at the time was, and I don't think this is a matter of subjectivity, one of the least talented teams in, I can't remember if they were in the Pac-12 at that point, or if they were still outside of that.
That was in the Pac.
But they were one of the least talented teams, full stop. I heard scouting stories because every team in the NFL has scouts, at least regional scouts are going to go out to every major team and even some of the minor ones. And when they went to Colorado in those days, it wasn't, who are your good players? It was, can you give me one player that I can bring back to my general manager and say, he's worth putting on our board? That is nearly impossible to find at the Power 5 level. And that was the case with Colorado. At the time, the only real transformative player that they had, he wasn't transformative at the time, he just developed into that guy in the NFL, was David Bakhtiari. He ended up being a 4th-round pick out of Colorado. That was the only real quality player, at least on offense, that they had at the time that Bieniemy was the play caller. On some level, you could say that is Bieniemy's fault because as a coach in college, you have to be part of the recruiting. But at the same time, he doesn't have to recruit in the NFL. The talent is going to be there or it's not going to be there. That's on the general manager. If Bieniemy is given the talent, I tend to think he's going to do a better job with it than he did at Colorado.
I'm a big fan of Eno Babers, the head coach at Syracuse right now. I feel like he should get a shot and come to the NFL and be an OC. I love his play calling. I really do.
That's a very unpopular opinion, but I share it with you. Dino Babers, and you look at not just what he's done at Syracuse, not what he did directly before in the MAC.
Illinois,
yeah, but if you look at all of his top assistants that have gone other places, those are some of the top offenses in college football. Sean Lewis, right now at Kent State, right off of that Babers tree, running almost an identical offense. He doesn't even put that many like twists on it. That was one of the top offenses, not just in the MAC, but in college football, full stop this year. The Dino Babers offense, there are limitations there too, as we discussed. There's limitations and advantages with every one of these schemes. You're seeing more of those concepts appear in the NFL. You look at what they're doing right now in Kansas City, and there's way more to it than what just Babers does in college, but some of those spread concepts are showing up in that scheme as well. So while I don't think Dino Babers is actually going to get a shot for an OC gig anytime soon, I absolutely think that he can succeed in the NFL. I really like him as a coach. I hope that he gets a long enough run at Syracuse because recruiting is an issue there. That's not a Babers thing. That's just a Syracuse thing. And if he's able to put together a decent group of talent, I think that's an extremely fun team to watch.
Exactly. And Syracuse is a basketball school as well. So, but I got another question. Somebody said they want to know your thoughts on Joe Brady.
So Joe Brady runs another different kind of offense. The closest comp I can think to it that might make sense to people who living in the South or following sports in the South is he comes off that Joe Moorhead tree, the offense that they ran at Mississippi State. Not that that's when Brady was there, but it's that offense, very RPO heavy, a lot of crossers, shallow crossers, and a lot of drive concepts. And those things, while very different from the way that like a Shannon offense will get players open or some of the more old school Bill Walsh West Coast offenses will get players open. It really does work at college and in the NFL. If you look at the Panthers right now, it's a good, not great group of offensive skill position players, and they get open all the time because of those concepts. It's a really well-designed and well-called offense. I think that's a credit to Joe Brady because while Matt Rule, the head coach there, is technically an offensive coach, if you go back to his earlier days, he was an offensive line assistant with the Giants and I believe also the Jets. He's not the one calling the plays. He's not the one designing the offense. He's taking more of a CEO approach. Joe Brady is the guy in charge of those offensive meetings. He's the guy calling the plays on game day. I think very highly of him. My only question is he ready? Because he's so young. And I know there's a lot of examples that people can throw out of really young coaches becoming really good head coaches. Sean McVay is obviously the prime example of this. He became a head coach in the NFL at 30. There's a very big difference, though. Sean McVay, by the time he became a head coach, had almost a full decade of coaching experience as a full-time assistant or as a coordinator. That's not the case with Joe Brady. He's really only become a full-time assistant, whether it's a coordinator or not, within the last 3 to 4 years. Doesn't mean he can't make the jump, but that is a much bigger hurdle when you consider, while he's led offensive meetings, he hasn't led full team meetings. He hasn't organized a training camp. He hasn't done a lot of those things that aren't, totally noticeable on game day, but do affect the final result. So I think Joe Brady is going to get a head coaching job this year, or at a minimum is going to interview for them. And I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a job and does well with it. But there are a lot of questions with him too. He's not just a slam dunk hire, even though that offense is really, really, really good.
Yeah, he's real. I like him as a play caller, but as far as running the team, I just don't think he's ready yet, man. I feel like just give him another year and see how that offense, because they still in rebuild mode out there in Carolina.
You're absolutely right. And again, with another year, that might be not just a good offense. That might be one of the 5 or 6 best offenses just because of how smart he is as a play designer and play caller. But you want to see it, right? Because there have been plenty of examples of like Kellen Moore in 2019. That was the number 1 offense by DVOA. It was one of the most efficient offenses of recent vintage. And granted, they lost Dak Prescott this year. There's a lot of other things you have to throw in when you're looking at that. But even before that injury, it was still an efficient offense, but there was a drop-off. When you have some of these coaches, you want, especially when they're really young and really inexperienced, you want to see it for multiple seasons before you hire them to be your head coach. You may not get that sort of flexibility because at this point in the NFL, anytime any offensive coordinator or offensive assistant shows a modicum of competency, they're considered for head coaching jobs. It's the way it works. So I don't know that Brady's going to be an option for teams in 2021 and slash 2022, but I think it's probably better for the NFL if he's given that chance to show that he can sustain an offense rather than just bring one in and have 1 year of success.
Exactly, because I feel like you hire him this year, it can be very similar to Lane Kiffin-ish type of hire. When the Raiders hired him, and I'm like, yeah, he's a little too young. Let him see. Let's see what he can do on a pro level first. But all right. One more question. Somebody said Rick Dennison. What you think about him?
He's one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. He's not always coached in that capacity, but everywhere that he has gone, that offensive line play has improved by a significant margin. There are a few guys like this in the NFL who may not be, whizzes in terms of the play calling, play design, but they get those players so much better prepared for game day. They don't need to run the cutest, craziest scheme, that they just have those players so ready to execute the scheme that they have that it works. That has been Dennison for the most part. I don't think that he's going to be a head coach next year, but he's someone that I would always want on my staff because the offensive line, even if he's not the offensive line coach in title, the offensive line is going to improve. And as we discussed multiple times already, everything can go well or completely fall apart if that offensive line is not performing the way it should.
Exactly. I like Dennison. Like we've been hearing Rick Smith, maybe the next GM for the Falcons. And we've been looking at ties he has. He has ties, to Kubiaks. He has ties to Wade Phillips. He has ties to Robert Saleh out there in San Francisco. And, when we looked at Kubiak when he was in Houston, he had Dennison as his OT for a little bit. And, I was like, because I like the idea of Dennison because, like we said, offensive line, and that's what we need. We need to bring somebody in here who can develop our young core of linemen to be like the best unit in the NFL. And I feel like they have the talent. We have the talent to do that. We just need somebody here to develop and elevate them.
Yeah, and certainly he could do that. I don't know if that ultimately makes sense as the head coach. He's had opportunities to interview for that in the past. Keep in mind, he's also an older coach. He turns 63 this upcoming year. He'll be 63 before week 1. Doesn't mean you shouldn't hire a coach like that. We've seen those sort of hires work in the past. Bruce Arians, who, the league in a certain sense had passed by as a head coaching candidate by the time he joined the Colts under Chuck Pagano. He turned it around very quickly with the Arizona Cardinals after he was first an interim with the Colts and then the full-time hire there. You want to consider those coaches at least to some degree because it's almost like an inefficiency, right? When we see big pools of talent and teams only looking at one part of that pool, that means that somebody's hiring the 5th, 6th, 7th worst version of a particular kind of coach. When you look at the whole pool, the opportunity to get a good coach increases significantly. The comp that I've made is almost like mid-19th or mid-20th century baseball when they finally started to integrate. The teams that did that first were the ones that had the biggest advantage because suddenly there was this gigantic pool of really high-level talent that only 2, 3, 4 teams initially were even looking at. That gave them huge advantages. And it's not even just the Dodgers had that advantage, obviously, with Jackie Robinson. The Cleveland Indians, they got 2 of the best players in all of the Negro Leagues. And that was one of the reasons they won that title in, I believe, it was sometime in the 50s or 60s. But either way, that was the right approach, not just because of the ethical part of it, but there's a giant pool of talent that nobody else is looking at. It makes sense for you to look at it because there's going to be opportunities there for you. So that's looking at older coaches and kind of bringing back to that comp. If you look at not just the NFL, but college as well, there is a disproportionate amount of white head coaches versus non-white head coaches. Unless you happen to think, and I personally don't think this, that coaching talent is evenly distributed, or rather, if you think it is evenly distributed and not something that's just the fiat of one group, that means there's a ton of high quality coaches that are not getting serious consideration because they don't fit a particular description or they're not interviewing in the way that GMs and owners want them to interview or whatever the reason is. And we keep seeing examples of this pop up. Look at Colorado right now. Carl Durrell was not getting interviewed for any other job in the NFL as a head coach or in college. He'd been a head coach at UCLA previously, had a decent amount of success, hadn't really gotten a lot of sniffs in that variety since. Goes to Colorado, they immediately become not like a great team, but they go from being one of the worst teams in that conference the last year to being almost statistically one of the best. It's not because there's something magic about Carl Durrell specifically. It's more of when you look at a pool of talent that no one else is, your chances of hitting on someone are a lot better. The same thing applies in the NFL. Looking at older coaches, looking at non-white coaches, these are things that can help a team find a good option. Because yeah, it's not like there are, there's no good white head coaches or white head coaching candidates either. That's the group that's getting picked over the most. Look at other areas because there are good head coaches there. We see it again and again when they do get chances.
Yeah, and like one of my favorite coach that I want the Falcons to hire is Don Martindale. I think he if he get hired and because he already saying that he wants to bring in Clemson's OC to be the offensive coordinator, and then
Tony
he's
Elliott,
talking
yeah.
about and then he said, I think he mentioned, who did he say is the DC? I think he said something like Wade Phillips or somebody like that as the oh no, he said Marvin Lewis as the defensive
Marvin,
coordinator.
the report I saw was that he was considering Marvin Lewis, Lovie Smith, and there was one more name which escapes me right
The
now.
OC,
But
the OC for Clemson. OC for
oh no, I
Clemson.
meant for the defensive coordinator. But yeah, Tony Elliott, the offensive coordinator for Clemson, is the attached name to Don Martindale. And this goes back to what we were just talking about. Defensive coordinators are not considered for head coaching positions nearly as often. It's not even just offensive coordinators, just offensive assistants, full stop. Don Martindale has done a tremendous job as a defensive coordinator for the Ravens. When he took over for Dean Pease, who himself is one of the best defensive coordinators in football. That is a very high bar to clear. And he cleared it. And he's cleared it every year that he's been in that position. So while Don Martindale may not be attached to a particular offensive scheme, he's someone who, it seems, is going to be a good head coach, or at least is going to be a worthwhile head coaching candidate to consider. If he can bring Tony Elliott, if he can bring any one of those names we just discussed as defensive coordinator, I think you have to consider him, not just if you're the Falcons, but if you're any of these teams in the league with an opening, because yeah, there are other candidates worthy of consideration. But we see time and time again, when you have a head coach candidate who himself is not an offensive play caller, but has a really good plan, that can work. Mike Zimmer with the Vikings is not an offensive play caller, obviously, but he has been able to pivot time and time again to whether it was a different play caller because the first one wasn't working or because his offensive coordinator got hired away. They are able to pivot. And that's why multiple of his OCs have become head coaches and they continue to work reasonably well on offense. I think you're seeing it right now with Carolina, with Matt Rule. He's not a defensive coordinator or wasn't a defensive coordinator, but he's not the offensive coordinator himself. He wasn't the play caller. He had to come in with a plan to make it work. And sort of the same thing happened going into last year's hiring cycles we're seeing now. When he was rumored for some of these head coaching jobs, he was attached to Joe Brady. That was out in the open. That was reported. The same way that Don Martindale is attaching himself to Tony Elliott. It's just really smart. It means that when he comes into the interview, it's already known, not just by the team that he's interviewing with, but with the media around, that he's coming in with this particular plan. I think that's really smart marketing. I think it's just a really smart approach overall.
It is, and that's what the Falcons need. I feel like a Don Martindale type of guy is what we need here in Atlanta. Because the man, he knows how to get results from, yes, he defense, but he also knows football. And I feel like you coming from a good, I say, world class organization in football, because we know the Ravens has been good for a long time.
It's absolutely correct.
You come in, we're not trying to be like the Ravens, but he has a competitive style and he knows what to get out of his players.
Also, on top of all that, he's really smart. And there's a lot of smart coaches in the NFL, but there are certain coaches that really stand out as just being incredibly intelligent. And in my interactions with him, he comes across as one of those guys. Intelligent coaches can fail too. It doesn't mean that he's automatically going to succeed, but you'd rather your coach be smart, right? Because when there are challenges, and every coach in every team in every city is going to face challenges in every year and over the course of any tenure that they have, you want them to have the flexibility in terms of their temperament to make adjustments and the intelligence to know what adjustments to make. Don Martindale, at least from what we've seen thus far, seems like he could be that kind of coach. So I'm with you. I think that's actually a smart plan for the Falcons or another team.
Exactly. Let me pull this up real quick. Going back to Nathaniel Hackett, this is his offense. When he was the OC for different teams, and currently with the Packers right now. We're looking at Football Outsiders DVOA 2013. The Bills was ranked 25th. 2014, they was ranked 26th. So they didn't get any better. They got a little worse. He went to Jacksonville in 2015. He was just a quarterback coach there for that year, and they was ranked 20th. And when he became the Well, he was still the quarterback coach a year later in 2016, and they was ranked 27th. So their offense got a little worse. Now, 2017 is the year that they made that almost a Cinderella story. They went to the ALC Championship game and got beat by the Patriots. Their offense was ranked 15th, and then that next year they was ranked 30th. Ugh. So like I said, I don't know how LaFleur hired him as the OC to go up there to Green Bay, because if I was looking at that, I'm like, ugh. But you look at 2019 last year, y'all was ranked 8th, and then now y'all ranked 2nd. Probably ranked higher now because how the way y'all played yesterday and then Kansas City played yesterday. Pretty sure y'all gonna by tomorrow y'all gonna probably be first in DVOA on offense.
Well, first or second doesn't really matter. You're still talking about a high level offense. So you threw up those numbers, and I would focus on this, whether you're talking about a pro Hackett argument or just talking about those offenses in general. Here are the leading quarterbacks in terms of passing yards for all of those offenses in
I know.
Buffalo.
Go ahead.
2013, it's EJ Manuel, who
Yeah.
is, by I would say conservative estimation, one of the worst first round quarterbacks selected in the last
Oof.
10 years. The following year, it was sort of the very final stages of Kyle Orton's career. And then you look with Jacksonville, we've already discussed it, that was Blake Bortles, not a good quarterback. So while I do very much value DVOA as a metric when you're talking about team value, I don't think it's always predictive when you're talking about the offensive play caller, because by DVOA, the Packers, the final year under McCarthy, was a top 10 offense. It wasn't a well-run offense, but because they had Aaron Rodgers, it finished in the top 10 in that metric. So I think you have to weigh personnel very heavily when you look at those things. And the personnel for those offenses was extremely limited until he got to Green Bay, that being Nathaniel Hackett, and had Aaron Rodgers. So yeah, you can't automatically say they have a top 10 offense by DVOA when he's been in Green Bay. Therefore, he's going to run a top offense anywhere. You have to consider what he is or is not bringing to the table. I think that's why he got hired to Green Bay in the first place. It's more about the schemes and concepts, the economy of ideas that he can really offer relative to then what he's going to be as a play caller or not, because LaFleur knew he was going to be the play caller in Green Bay when he got the job, or wherever he was going to be a head coach. He knew that he was going to be the play caller. He wanted his top of offensive assistants, whether that's just the coordinator or the coordinator or the quarterback's coach, to be able to bring in ideas and take command of particular parts of the offense and give him ideas for game day. That's what's happening in Green Bay, as we discussed earlier. That red zone offense, he's not calling those plays, but those play designs, those are Nathaniel Hackett. If you look at a lot of the tight end leaks, some of those whip routes that have been really effective for them, especially this year, those are not, they're being called by Matt LaFleur. They're designed, though, by Nathaniel Hackett. Now, that's not an entire offense, obviously, but that speaks really well to him, because the red zone, especially at the goal line, is a really hard place for an offensive to operate. Because
he's just pretty much, so Hackett is pretty much watching tape on the opposing defense, and before game day, he's written up a certain amount of plays to give to LaFleur and say, hey, you might want to look at this. You might want to do this, during the game, because this is what I've seen. This is what I scouted.
Oh, yeah. And this is not just with Hackett. This is true of Luke Getsy, the quarterback's coach for Green Bay. They go into those final game planning meetings and saying, here is the menu of plays we like for whatever their situations are. In this case, we're talking about the red zone with Hackett. And then from that, LaFleur will make his selections in concert with the quarterback. That's not a Green Bay thing. That's an every team thing.
Yeah, every team does that. Well, except for the Falcons. I don't think Dirk Cutter does even watch film. Oh my goodness!
I don't think that's actually true, but I understand why you feel that way. The way that they
I'm telling you, man.
times.
I'm telling you, look, this man copy and paste the same game plan every week. He copied and pasted.
You're not going to hear me argue that Dirk Cutter should be the offensive play caller for the Atlanta Falcons in 2021.
That's just, man, it's just horrible to see this offense just go down the drain. You got Matt Ryan, Julio, Calvin Ridley, Todd Gurley, and you telling me we can't even score in the red zone? This is crazy, man.
Yeah, and honestly, the red zone offense has been an issue for the Falcons in varying levels since Shanahan left. Some of that is just coincidence because certain players get hurt, and that really affects what you can and cannot do in the red zone. But like at a certain point, when you've had, what has it been now, 4 or 5 years since Shanahan left, and it's different play callers. It's not just Cutter. It was Sarkisian at first. Like that becomes a bigger issue than just the play caller. You have to start looking at the head coach, and that's a big part of the reason that Dan Quinn is not the head coach of the Falcons anymore.
Exactly. All right, so we'll go ahead and do some wrap-up questions before we head on out. Leader among men. This is something that Arthur Blank said in his meeting after he fired both Dimitrov and Dan Quinn. Does Paul Hackett kind of fit that role, or does he fit that role, leader among men, as to be the next head coach?
So the answer is a very qualified yes. So if you were looking at the way that the Packers players over the last 2 years have discussed the staff, the new staff, there are some holdovers from the McCarthy era, but most of that staff came in with LaFleur. Probably the most popular of those coaches is Nathaniel Hackett. Aaron Rodgers has described him as being the guy who brings a lot of energy and a lot of humor to those meetings. And that sounds like a small thing, but keep in mind, when you are in meetings almost every day of the week, starting from the beginning of training camp until whenever that team loses its last game in December, January, or February, there's a lot of mundane moments that you need to steamroll over. Having a coach that can bring new ideas, bring excitement, really does matter. And not that that's a thing that's totally Nathaniel Hackett. There are other coaches that do that as well, but it does check an important box for him. Now, when it comes to the scheme itself, we've already discussed the questions about whether he will bring a more true version of the Shanahan scheme back to Atlanta if he were to get the job there, or if he's going to bring some amalgamation of the Shanahan LaFleur ideas and what he ran when he was the offensive coordinator for Jacksonville and Buffalo. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure Nathaniel Hackett totally knows. That's something he's going to have to figure out if and when he gets a head coaching job with whatever team gives it to him. But I think he's worthy of consideration, even if he's not going to be the favorite for any of these jobs. I think he checks the basic boxes of being someone worthy of head coaching consideration.
All right. Last question. If y'all have any questions, y'all better go ahead and send them to me before we wrap up the show. Do you think if he is considered to be interviewed for the Falcons and they kind of want to hire him, do you think he's the right person to fit this team?
To fit, I'm sorry?
If the Falcons decide to hire Nathaniel Hackett, do you think he's the right person to fix this team? But looking at everything, with the Falcons going on right now, defenses have been historically bad ever since Matt Ryan's tenure here. Offensive line, yes, we have the talent, but it's just not performing like where it needs to be. Plethora of injuries, that can be based on the training staff that was hired here in Atlanta. And this, what do you think? Like, do you think he can fix this team? Or do you think we should just look at somebody else in the league? Or who would be the right coach to hire if you don't think it's Nathaniel Hackett?
So he would not be my first choice, not specifically for the Falcons, for any of these teams right now. If for no other reason than I just think there's better options out there this particular cycle. By next year, that could be totally different, and he could be one of the, if not the top candidate. So that's part of the evaluation. I definitely think that he's someone who can come into a team like the Falcons and update the offense, whether it's, again, the Shanahan version he's bringing in or bringing back to the Falcons, or if it's an amalgamation of his schemes. I think he can bring in new life in that regard because, as you've pointed out, I don't even know how many times on the show, Dirk Cutter is not bringing a lot of creativity or new ideas to the offense. I don't think that'll be an issue with Nathaniel Hackett. Specifically over the last few years, one of the big parts of his job has been looking at not just the Packers' own film, but film from other teams and not just other NFL teams, once in college too, and bringing those ideas and incorporating them into the offense in concert with the quarterback and the head coach. That suggests to me that he can, not just that first season, be able to adjust the offense, but find ways to continue evolving that offense over the course of however long his tenure is. That doesn't mean that he's number one choice, but I do think, again, that's something where he can take what is a very big problem for that particular team right now and offer immediate solutions, if not a total revamp.
All right. Also, hold on, I got a couple more questions that the chat gave me. They said my boy LaTravis, he said that our red zone offense was top 10 in 2018 with Sark. I forgot about that. It was.
That's by efficiency, but not by points, and he's not wrong to bring that up. Efficiency is very important, obviously, because you want to turn as many of those red zone opportunities into touchdowns as possible, or at least get points out of it. The issue for the Falcons that year, if I remember correctly, is that they weren't getting to the red zone often enough to really take advantage of that. So while he's absolutely right to point out that Sarkisian was able to do things that maybe collectively we don't give him enough credit for, and maybe that's one of the reasons that he's a hot head coaching candidate in college right now, that it was sort of a piece of a larger picture, and the larger picture was still ultimately problematic relative to what had happened under Kyle Shanahan in 2016.
Okay. One more question. Devontae said, what are your thoughts on Matt Ryan going forward as an Atlanta Falcon? I think he said this early in the show, but you can go ahead and touch on it again.
Yeah, it's going to be extreme. Even if they wanted to, for sake of argument, trade him, that would be very, very difficult. Not just because it would create, I think, almost a $10 million cap or dead money hit immediately. Or sorry, the dead money hit is bigger. It would
It's
cost
like
them almost $10 million.
It's 60 mil.
Yeah, but in terms of like the difference in cap total on the 2021 books, they would lose almost $10 million in cap space. If he's cut, I think it's a trade. It's a little less, but still a lot. And again, that's hypothetically if they even wanted to. Consider that the cap is coming down next year in all probability because of all of the economic shortfalls that the league is dealing with because of the pandemic. And on top of that, like Matt Ryan is still a really, really good quarterback. I just don't think it makes sense for the Falcons, even if they're planning to do a sizable revamp, to get rid of him right now. I still think he has several good years left in him. And unless there's a team that's going to blow them away with a Godfather offer, like hypothetically, if Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers say, we're going to give you 3 first-round picks for him, then you find a way to make the deal. Other than a situation like that, I don't see the benefit to getting rid of him, or with some of their other older star players like Julio Jones. At least give it 2021, see what happens. And if it looks like it's not going to work out, you're in a better cap situation in 2022, both in terms of the overall cap and in terms of those contracts in particular, to make a deal then. I think at least for next season, the smartest approach is let those guys come back and work with whomever the new head coach is.
Yeah, let's see if they can get the chemistry going, and if it works well, then don't change it. Let it let it stay. But if you're seeing that he's struggling, and then you know you see a massive dropout off, then yeah. But even now, like look at the game he played yesterday. Played really well, but folks still blaming him that he lost the game. I'm like, no, he threw 300 something yards and had a high quarterback rating yesterday. Like
He's a really efficient player. He's a really smart player. I know that there's been times in the games where he's made mistakes, but that's usually because his team's in position where he has to force it. That is going to be the case for any quarterback put in that situation. When he's in more neutral game scripts, he's a really, really reliable quarterback. And that's almost like that's too conservative of a compliment. He's really good. Even if he's never going to be MVP 2016 Matt Ryan again, he can perform at a very high level with the right things around him, with the right scheme and the right play caller. I am not ready to give up on Matt Ryan if I'm the Falcons.
I'm gonna disagree with you on that. About I think he can be a MVP again. Look at Aaron Rodgers right now. I feel like he's on pace to win another MVP this season. If we bring, like I said, if we do the same thing with Green Bay's done, bring in a better, competent play caller, I feel like Matt Ryan he is an elite quarterback. I don't care what anybody say. You don't
Well,
bring
that's
all
all
these
more to the point, right? Like whether you think he's going to be a really, really good quarterback or potentially an MVP quarterback again, those are both arguments to keep him going forward, at least for next season. As you put it, if they go through 2021 and it doesn't work out, or at least it doesn't look like it's going to work out, then adjust, because the 2022 offseason is going to be a lot better for the Falcons and for those contracts to make a deal. But give them the chance, because it doesn't make sense in terms of the cap to get rid of them now. And there's a lot of upside there, whether you think that he's a guy who could be really good, but not great, or like you, a guy who thinks he can be an MVP. In either one of those scenarios, the best option available is to give him 2021 and just reevaluate this time next year.
I agree. And we're not going through a rebuild. We just retooling. They already, Arthur Blank and Rich McKay, they already said that we just retooling. It's impossible. The team is not the talent we have on this team is not that bad. We just been poorly coached.
Yeah,
Dan
like if
Quinn,
they end up trading Matt Ryan, then it's a rebuild in the way that you mean it. Anything short of that, it's a recalibration. But again, if Matt Ryan is there and they bring in an offensive coach or a head coach with the right offensive coordinator, things can go very, very well. I know that there are a lot of good teams in the NFC South, and that's ultimately going to make it harder for anyone to win that division if you're a team like the Falcons or the Panthers. But one, Tom Brady only has one more year in his deal and is likely to retire after that, and could, just because of his age, through no fault of his own, could fall off a cliff physically the way that we saw Peyton Manning at the end of his Broncos tenure. And Breeze is very likely to retire at the end of the season.
This year. Breeze is done this year. So pretty much it's just going to be the Panthers and the Falcons really looking like favorites going into 2021 season. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Nate, what's good? The running back position. Right now, man, I'm more concerned about the offensive line and the play caller, man. That right there is going to be predicated on how we go moving forward. I'm not really big on drafting a running back early, because we've seen teams draft running backs day 2, day 3, and be really good. Look at Alvin Kamara. All right. A.J. Dillon is a good one as well. Day 2 pick. Um,
Honestly, day 2 is still really, really high for a running back. You look at some of the best running backs in the league right now. Like if you brought up AJ Dillon, so we'll focus on Green Bay here. Their top running back, Aaron Jones, was a 5th-round pick, and that's not an anomaly. You see this happen all the time. The smart teams, with extremely rare exception, tend to draft multiple running backs on the final day of the draft and bring in undrafted free agents and just let the chips fall where they may. Because even if it's hard to predict which one of those guys is going to be good, if you get enough dice rolls, one of those guys is likely to hit. And then you don't have to spend an early pick or spend a big contract. Like I know the Todd Gurley contract isn't crazy, but it's still more money than they're spending on any other running back on that team right now. And they can get rid of him very easily. I don't think that contract is really an albatross for them, but it was an albatross for the Rams. It's a big reason why they spent a 1st-round pick on him, extended him, and then within 2 years of that, let him go. I think the smarter allocation of resources is spending on the offensive line, quarterback, and receiver in terms of the offense, and figuring out running back last or throwing late-round picks at them. That tends to be the best approach.
Look at what the Saints doing. Look at what other teams doing. They invested in the offensive line, and then they drafted, a running back late. If you build an offensive line the right way, anybody can run behind it.
The Dallas Cowboys have proved this time and time again in the last, not the last few years because Elliott has struggled. But look at those really great Dallas lines they had about 3 to 5 years ago. I mean, the corpse of Darren McFadden was a 1,000-yard rusher behind that offensive line.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to say something about Darren McFadden. Like, Darren McFadden became a 1,000-yard rusher. And that ain't just because he found the youth. It's because of the offensive line. So, all right. Yeah, I agree with you, Nick, man. Quadri Olison, man, we doing this man a disservice, just keeping this man inactive. I don't understand why. And I feel like we don't even know what we have in him. So we haven't even played him. So I'm not even really worried about drafting a running back at this point. We could probably even get somebody like you just said, Jason, to get somebody to an undrafted free agent and see how they.
It happened. Look, it happened just this year. One of the top rookie, if not the top rookie rusher this year, is in Jacksonville, an undrafted free agent. Again, it's not that any team can predict who the late round pick or undrafted free agent is going to be that becomes a good running back, but they are so cheap and so easy to acquire at volume. You just get 2 or 3 guys out of those particular groups, and you're likely to hit on at least one of them. It tends to be the way the smart teams approach that position. And even if you're not going to all the time get like an absolute superstar, like Alvin Kamara, or Christian McCaffrey, if you're waiting till the final day of the draft, you can get guys who are just one notch below at a fraction of the price. And then with those saved resources, invest in other positions, the offensive line, as you mentioned, quarterback, receiver, whatever. It tends to be overall a better approach.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right.
Well, it was a blast, man.
Yes. Once again, let everybody know who you are, where they can find you.
Well, my name, as you can see on the screen, is Jason Hirschhorn. You can find me on Twitter at @by_JBH. My work is at SBNation.com. I've written for NFL.com, SportsIllustrated.com. So I hope you'll read some of my stuff.
All right. Thank you again for coming on. Everybody who watched live, appreciate y'all joining the show live. You watching this at a later time, hit us up in the comment section and let us know what you think about Nathaniel Hackett. Do you think we should interview him, or you think, hey, no, we don't need him, or you still on the enemy train? Hey, let me know that as well. I will be back later on this evening at 6:00 p.m. to talk about the next rumored GM for the Falcons, Rick Smith. He's a former GM for the Houston Texans. So stay tuned for that. And then we also going to be back at 7 tonight to talk about the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl preview, UGA versus Cincinnati. So stay tuned for that. We got a jam-packed day here at FILA Sports Podcast. If you're new to the channel, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share this content out with Atlanta sports fanatics, and hit us up in the comment section. As always, come holler at your hometown sports podcast. It's your boy The Dunn with another episode of The Dunn's favorite scouting head coaches in the NFL. Y'all have a great afternoon. See y'all later. Y'all be safe this afternoon.